Professor Matthew Harrison. He's an award-winning scientist at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, and his team uses systems thinking to develop skills, technologies and practices for agri-food sustainability. Matthew also happens to be an adjunct professor at Lanzhou University, Yangtze University, and China Agricultural University, which I'm sure there's an interesting story behind that. And today we're talking about carbon cycling 101. So please welcome Matthew.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate you're busy, and thanks also for the conference organisers for the invitation to present. We all turn up, and all of these tents are manufactured, all the laneways are in, the flags are up, sort of thing, so there's a lot of work put in behind the scenes, so I appreciate that. My name's Matthew Harrison. I work at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture based in Launceston, and a lot of our work is on carbon and carbon cycling and climate change adaptation, and work a lot with farmers, government and industry to reduce emissions. I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa, Pakana and Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of the land upon which we live and work. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Now, if you listen to nothing else, this is the most important slide. So I thought I'd put the conclusions last in case you leave. So you got the key messages first. So carbon's always cycling. It makes up our composition, it makes up our food, it makes up these tents, it makes up the grass beneath our feet. So the term decarbonisation, I think, is a little bit misguided. I think we're really talking about defossilisation, reducing the use of oil and gas. You'll never get rid of carbon, so decarbonisation, I think, is a little bit misguided. I work a lot with the livestock sector, so we did a high-resolution study and we looked at greenhouse gas emissions over time, at a higher resolution than ever done before, and we found that greenhouse gas emissions of the beef and sheep sector have gone down by about 70% since 2010, and that's more than any other sector. We looked at a high-resolution study of planting trees on farm, a whole bunch of different farms across Australia. So from cool temperate zones such as this, where we are today, to the centre of Australia, which has got about 150 millimetres of rain a year. So very arid. And we looked at planting trees, environmentally bespoke trees at all of these locations. And we found that no matter where you were, it had substantial benefits for biodiversity and a whole bunch of different biodiversity indicators as well. We worked with each of these farmers spread across the country to say, well, what would you prospectively implement if you were going to reduce emissions? And then we went away and modelled it. Now, the important thing, probably the novelty in the research that we do is we look at profitability, we look at impacts on productivity, we look at impacts on biodiversity, and we don't just look at greenhouse gas emissions. So we looked at 30 different changes to all of these production systems and agroecological environments, and we found that planting anti-methanogenic pastures, that's types of legumes that reduce methane when the animal eats them, and for sheep enterprises, converting to an ultra-fine genotype were the most prospective interventions of all. So the most profitable, had the biggest effect on emissions, had the biggest effect on productivity. And the greatest benefit from any change in a farm system, people talk about innovations or interventions as if they apply generically to all farms and all locations. They don't. That's because farms operate in a continuum. You might have a practice that has a big effect for one farm, and you might have the same practice applied over the fence that has no effect. And that's because the farmer over the fence has spent 30 years working on that problem, and so that you implement that practice change, it doesn't have any effect. So the biggest benefit, it sounds a little bit philosophical, but the biggest benefit is when you address an underlying problem. So whether that's degradation or salinity or too many rabbits or too much horehound, whatever is the big problem, address that, and you have the biggest effect on carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, profit and biodiversity. So that's the key messages. Now, this is not an exam, but there will be prizes for those who listen carefully. So the carbon is always cycling, so it's fixed from photosynthesis, from trees. Then that degrades after a while, so that you get organic matter falling to the surface of the ground, and then that's sedimented into the soil, some of it. And a fraction of that, again, is after hundreds of millions of years incorporated into soils, and that's how fossil fuels come about. you also have losses. So you have soil respiration. So these soils beneath our feet now, they're sequestering carbon. So carbon is going in. Carbon is also coming out. So a question that I often get from farmers is, why don't I get paid for the grass that I grow? That's because you assimilate carbon in the springtime and then you lose it again in summer. So it comes in and goes out. You technically would get paid for carbon if your soil carbon went up over time. The only way to get paid for that is through an auditing scheme, and you have to have statistically rigorous measurements to show, because soils are very variable, that soil carbon has actually gone up over time. The problem with the carbon cycle is that humans have disrupted the cycle. So we're drilling down beneath the mantle, digging out oil and gas, burning it. That CO2 is circulating in the atmosphere, and it would have otherwise been left buried deep beneath the mantle. So that's the problem with the carbon cycle. And so if you look at the global carbon budget in 2023, we emitted, as a global community, we emitted about 41 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's all greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. Carbon sinks into the land and the sea absorbs quite a lot of carbon, was about 23 billion tonnes. So the net difference was about 17 billion tonnes. So that meant in last year alone, we were circulating about 17 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere that would have otherwise not been emitted. And so if you look at greenhouse gas emissions since about 1750 to today, more than half of those greenhouse gas emissions were emitted since 1990. And so the rate with which we're emitting them, despite aspirations to reduce emissions, is still going up. And we've known for a long time that greenhouse gas emissions create warming. And so that, what I've shown there from 1850 to 2024 is global average temperatures. And since about 1980, global average temperatures are about 1 degree warmer. And you might say, well, 1 degree is not much, goes up and down every day. The problem with that is that climate change creates climate change, so you get a positive feedback loop. So probably a little known fact is that the biggest greenhouse gas is water vapour, and that traps a lot of heat. So the more greenhouse gas emissions that you have in the atmosphere, the greater the warming that creates, and it creates a positive feedback loop. So the atmosphere holds more moisture, it goes for longer before it rains, you get more droughts, you get more extreme heat, you get more bushfires, and when it does rain, you get more rain, so you get flooding. That's why scientists are so worried about each incremental change in temperature. And we've known for a long time that that creates additional variability. So rainfall variability is getting more extreme. You're getting more droughts, they're more severe, and when it does rain, you're getting more rain. And if you look at the average percentage of Australian surface subject to extreme heat, that's just gone exponential. So what I've shown there is decile 10, which is 10 out of 10 temperatures, and that's just gone up exponentially, and that's linked with anthropogenic warming. So various sectors, greenhouse, the transport and energy sector and agriculture sector have come up with their various aspirations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So Meat and Livestock Australia, which is responsible for beef and sheep, that has come up with what's called the Carbon Neutral 2030 Initiative, or CN30. So we did a very high resolution study and we looked at all carbon sinks in the country, trees, soils and emissions, so depending on where cattle and sheep populations were. So we accounted for all of the major land uses, 25 by 25 metre grid cells, and we simulated each of those over time between 2010 and 2021. And so we looked at how carbon changed. And so you can pick up bushfires, you can see woody regrowth, you can see various species growing and disappearing sort of thing. We also accounted for where cattle and sheep are in the country now. Most of them are actually in Queensland, but a lot of sheep in the south. So when you look at average net greenhouse gas emissions per hectare for each of these regions, the lowest region, which is sort of sucking in carbon in some regions, was the rangelands, and that's a little bit surprising because it's more arid, gets less rainfall. Whereas the highest regions with the highest emissions were sort of in the southern corners of the country. So you've got southwestern WA, the Glenelg Hopkins region, you've got Gippsland, and you've got the Midlands of Tasmania. And that's mainly related to stocking rates and stocking densities. So those regions in the south get more rainfall, so people tend to pack in more animals per hectare. So your methane emissions per hectare are higher. The figure on the left is sort of carbon sink, so that's amount of sequestration over time, and you can see that net emissions are less related to that than they are to average stocking rates. And so when you aggregate that across the country, you sum up all emissions, methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, CO2, you get a graph like that. And so that shows net greenhouse gas emissions for each year over time between 2010 and 2020. And average net greenhouse gas emissions have gone down by about 70%, which, as I said before, is more than any other sector. But most of that is due to that green bar. And that green bar is avoided deforestation and, to a lesser extent, regeneration. The dark blue bar at the bottom, which is pretty consistent, is enteric methane, and that hasn't really changed. That's the tough one. So if we're to get that last segment down to zero, which would be net zero, you're going to have to reduce enteric methane. So there are ways to do that, simple ways and more complex ways, which I'll talk about a bit later, but suffice to say that it's easier to modify carbon sequestration in trees and soils than it is to modify enteric methane, because you have to do that every day. Enteric methane is the methane that they burp out. Now, what I'm going to do is a quiz. Now, this could go spectacularly wrong, because I haven't done this before. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out 3 questions. So I'm going to read out one question, and the first person to yell out the right answer will get a prize. And I might get silence. But we'll see how we go. So by how much has the global carbon budget been imbalanced by humans in 2023? Correct. Catch. $17 billion tonnes. Global average temperatures are 1 degree warmer since what year? 1980. In what regions of Australia are greenhouse gas emissions per hectare the greatest?
Southwest, West Australia, Gippsland, bit of Tassie and the Midlands.
Correct.
You misjudged your audience.
Disclaimer on anyone gets hit in the head here. Good listeners. So the next part I want to talk about is how you actually quantify farm level emissions, because I get that question a lot from farmers. There's basically 3 main greenhouse gas emissions on farms. So one is methane, which is the biggest if you're a livestock farm. Then you've got nitrous oxide, which is from nitrogen fertiliser mainly, and urine to a lesser extent. So Matthew's urine bale would be emitting a lot of nitrous oxide. And then you've got CO2. And CO2, people think, oh, you reduce energy use. Not unless you're a big manufacturing facility. CO2 is usually pretty small. So you sum up methane from fermentation, from nitrous oxide and from CO2. And then what you've got to do is you've got to subtract the carbon that's been sequestered, or that's called carbon removals. So carbon sequestered in the soil, if it's demonstrably gone up, or carbon sequestered in trees. Now, carbon sinks can be positive or negative. So if you burn your trees, well, you've got to add that. You've lost that carbon. If your soil carbon goes down, which it can do in a drought, you've got to add that. So you sum up methane, nitrous oxide, CO2, and you take away carbon sequestered in trees and soils. And that gives you your annual carbon footprint. That's done on an annual basis. So some years it'll be high, some years it'll be low. Yes. So that would be accounted for in the soil. So if your soil carbon has demonstrably gone up and it takes a long time to change, then you would take that off your carbon budget. If you count both. So the burp comes out as methane, which is that first one, and the carbon sequestered by roots, which mainly through carbohydrates in the soil, and microbial carbon. If that's gone up, you take that away. If it's gone down, you've got to add it.
How realistic is it, though, to be doing soil carbon measurements on a proper soil carbon measurement?
That's a big question. It's very expensive. You can model it. The $64 million question is, how do you measure soil carbon accurately in a cheap way? And I don't think there's an answer to that yet. But if you want to go in a carbon scheme where you get paid for soil carbon, you have to sample in a statistically rigorous way.
So realistically, when we're doing our annual carbon emissions footprint, we're not including soil carbon.
You can. What I'd encourage people to do, irrespective of a carbon scheme, would be to take detailed measurements, so satellite imagery, photos, livestock records, and your logbook sort of thing. So then you can go back 5 years and demonstrate, well, I have changed, I've improved growth, I've improved carrying capacity. So if it comes to that, you've got the records. Carbon schemes are sort of costly and take a lot more paperwork sort of thing, but
That's a whole other seminar.
that's another seminar.
And I should have mentioned earlier that there will be time at the end for questions, so do keep your questions, and we'll have at least sort of 15 minutes at the end.
So all of those are direct emissions. So they're technically called Scope 1 and Scope 2 because they're mainly from the farm. And they're for a normal farm, they're the big ones. Unless you're a transport company that specialises in transporting milk or something, then your emissions are off the farm. But you've also got to account for upstream emissions, and they're called Scope 3 emissions. So that's things like the electricity used to power that light somewhere. The emissions associated with that power have to be counted as part of this farm's budget. Any nitrogen used, transported to the farm, the CO2 from the fuel, has to be counted. So they're called Scope 3 emissions. Carbon footprint is usually measured on a carbon dioxide equivalence per hectare basis per year. And then you've got emissions intensity, which is emissions per unit product. So you might have 100 kilograms of CO2 per tonne of grain, or you might have 10 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per tonne of beef. And you want your emissions intensity to be as low as possible. I don't think emissions intensity is necessarily a holistic metric, but that's what most people use. I'm not going to talk about that. So you might say then, well, what practices reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I get that question a lot. And there's many different things that you can do. If you improve animal management, so enteric methane, which was the big blue bar that I showed earlier, if you fatten up your lambs faster and you sell them earlier and they're off the farm, that avoids methane in a big way. If you cull unproductive animals, ewes that don't bear lambs, that reduces methane emissions. If you increase weaning rates for whatever reason, if you improve health or you get rid of worm burden or whatever it is, that reduces emissions intensity. Then you've got things like low emissions feed supplements. Now, they're really good, but you have to do it every day or thereof to reduce methane emissions. It's important to note that methane burped out doesn't come out in a constant flow. It comes out in burps. So you might get nothing, and then all of a sudden you get 8,000 parts per million. It's worth noting that a healthy animal produces a lot less methane than a sick animal. So sick animals actually produce a lot more methane. And then you've got things like animal genetics, research underway for that for a long time. I don't think it's been that successful to date. Hopefully there's no one here that works in that area. Methane vaccine and rumen bolus, they're more advanced things, and a lot of people have expressed interest in things like methane vaccine. Not commercially available that I'm aware of. You've got a whole bunch of different options. So nitrogen, if you use nitrogen fertilisers, compost or synthetic, think about applying it when the plant is actively growing. So if you apply it when the plant's not growing, when it's cold and wet in the middle of winter, most of that goes as nitrous oxide emissions and ammonia. Reduce fossil fuel usage, sort of, unless you're a big user. Collaborative supply chain arrangements, good for smaller producers because it mitigates financial, environmental and market risks. And then you've got options for increasing your carbon sinks, so that's increasing carbon removals. That first one, restoring degraded landscapes, I've got 3 stars there because it's got multiple benefits. Not just improves soil carbon, but improves productivity, improves nutrient holding capacity, improves biodiversity, improves carrying capacity, so it's got multiple benefits. Then you've got things like anything that you can do to improve soil fertility and get more growth will sequester more carbon. And you don't really even need to measure soil carbon, you just need to measure growth. So if your average growth and your ground cover is increased, seasonally averaged, well, your soil carbon has probably gone up. And then you've got things like clay delving. That works in some environments, not in others, so I wouldn't encourage people to do that without a bit of testing first. Organic amendments is a big one. Compost, biochar to the soil, because you're importing carbon. Then you've got things like incorporating deep-rooted legumes into pastures. Good for drought tolerance, but doesn't do a lot for greenhouse gas emissions. And then you've got restoring ecosystem services, arguably more harder, but has not just carbon, has a whole bunch of other benefits, so biodiversity and whatever. Dung beetles, really, really good. So if you can monitor their populations, if you can introduce them, really, really good, multiple benefits. So carbon farming can have multiple co-benefits and trade-offs. So, improve soil carbon reduces emissions, but you also increase productivity. So we wrote a paper about that in the prestigious journal Global Change Biology. That's available online, and if anyone would like a copy, feel free to send me an email. Now I'm going to do another quiz. So the first person to yell out the right answer gets the prize. So what percentage of Australian greenhouse gas emissions gone down by since 2010? Who's? You got it. She got the prize, but I got sued for hitting someone in the head. Around 68%. What are the three main forms of farm-level greenhouse gas emissions? That's one. That's two. What's the third one? One of them's methane. That's it, yep.
Can you repeat the three, Matthew?
So the three greenhouse gas emissions are methane, nitrous oxide and CO2. Water vapour is the biggest greenhouse gas emission of all, but because it's natural and you can't do anything about it, it's not often counted. The third question and the last question: other than planting trees, name one avenue for increasing carbon sinks. Biochar, spreading biochar. Strawberries and cream. So,
Can you repeat the question?
a little bit, yeah. So the question was just on the 68%, because they haven't cleared more stuff, cleared more trees, isn't that a bit smoke and mirrors there? Sort of, in a way, but that's technically allowed. So it's a little bit creative accounting.
We were going to paddock and we didn't clear it, so we get a benefit.
Yeah, but that's technically a method, so you can get paid for that. So if you can demonstrate, and this is the thing about additionality, I get a lot of complaints about additionality. Additionality means you can demonstrate that you weren't going to do something, or you were going to do something, like remove that forest, and then you don't, well, you get paid for that carbon. So that's the thing, it's a little bit subjective. What the government want is practices that remove additional carbon out of the atmosphere to avoid global warming. So you can see where they're coming from. Farmers, on the other hand, are saying, well, if I've built my land up and got forests and high soil carbon over the last 100 years, well, I've got nowhere to improve it further. Well, then if I enrol in a carbon market, I don't get paid because I can't get additionality. That's also true. So I've worked with the government for a long time, and I've complained for many, many years. The big wheels of government turn very slowly, but they do listen. So I advocate that people should be paid for carbon stocks, what's there now, a forest or carbon stores, rather than a carbon flux, which means improving carbon. Anyway, that's an aside. So we work with farmers all across the country, real farms, and we put a hell of a lot of work into calibrating these models. So to get livestock production right, grass production right, biodiversity, profitability, all of these sort of multidisciplinary metrics. And if you just look at the farm in the centre, 163 millimetres a year, 500,000 hectares, and the farm at the edge, CAC2, was about 750 hectares to 1,100 millimetres a year. So very different capacities to store carbon and implement changes to reduce emissions. So we work with each of these farmers, geospatially referenced. This was a farmer in the Midlands. And we said, if you were to plant 10% of your farm area to trees, where would you plant them? So this is sort of called demand-driven research. So we, in silico, on the computer we planted trees and we simulated that growth, that change in carbon over time, and we simulated the impact on biodiversity. Where you plant trees has a big effect for biodiversity, things like wildlife corridors. And if there's a threatened species in your area, a threatened frog or whatever it is, big effects on biodiversity, but it depends on where you are. So we looked at that and worked with each farmer, and we looked at carbon benefits and biodiversity benefits. I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice to say, planting trees on farm, native vegetation this is, had demonstrable benefits for all of your biodiversity indicators, habitat, threatened species, plant persistence, but didn't happen after 5 years. You need at least 15 or 20 years to get real benefits. And that's really because trees and they need time to provide effective habitat. We also looked at carbon sequestered in properties. So dark green means a lot of carbon there, light green means less carbon, and pretty fortuitously we found that carbon sequestration was highest in the areas that didn't really have pastures. So this guy, where those white zones are, he had a whole bunch of remnant vegetation which didn't have pastures. Carbon sequestration, were he to sow native vegetation in those clumps there, was highest. And carbon sequestration along his fence lines was also relatively the highest. And that's good because you're not taking away productive pasture area. So if you just look at carbon sequestered, and this is done in a very dynamical way, you get growth and you get degradation, you've got barks and leaves and stored carbon and dead organic matter. If you look at carbon sequestered over 25 years, for the farm right up the top and the farm in Tasmania, around about the same rainfall, very different capacity to sequester carbon. 38 tonnes of CO2 per hectare in the north, about 110 tonnes of CO2 in the south, and that's because it's not just rainfall, but a whole bunch of different factors influence the ability to sequester and permanently store carbon. So then we co-designed these practices with the farmers. We said, what do you want us to look at? We'll model it. We'll look at the impact of productivity, on profit, on biodiversity, and we'll simulate it in a dynamical way. We did a whole bunch of different things. Some of them were common. Some of them were unique to that farm. Now, this is probably the most complicated graph in the presentation, but what it basically says is where the farm is that crosshairs. So that's the baseline. And there's a hell of a lot of work in that crosshairs because that means we've calibrated the model to the actual production, profitability, carbon stores in soils. And for each farm that's different, but we've centred them all on that crosshairs. What I've shown on the y-axis is the change in gross margin. So anything below that dotted line is a cost. Anything above that dotted line is a gain, so you really want to improve profit. The farm's a business. Anything to the left of that vertical axis is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is what you want. And anything to the right is an increase, because this is what I'm talking about, trade-off sort of thing. So ideally you would want to be up in the top left-hand corner, because that's higher profit and lower emissions. So I've called that one there where you get lower emissions and lower profit the win-lose zone. I've called this one the lose-lose zone because your emissions have gone up and your profit's gone down, which is probably not what you want. Then you've got higher emissions and higher profit in the top right-hand corner. And then you've got lower emissions and higher profit, which is really what you want. So you want those interventions to be moved up in that zone. So there weren't many things that actually were in the lose-lose zone, some forms of altered productivity. So productivity, it's easy to get that too high. So too much stocking rate, and it's all right in a good year, but when you get a drought sort of thing and you're trying to hang on to them, you've got higher emissions, you've got loss of soil carbon, you've got loss in profit. So carrying capacity was the big one. Then we had increasing lamb weaning rates in that lose-win zone, and that was sort of in there because it had a beneficial effect for productivity, but it also increased supplementary feeding, so need for hay and grain. There was a lot of interventions or a change to the existing farm system that reduced emissions but come at a cost. A lot of them. And those error bars indicate the variability in prices. Low emissions feed supplements, they had big effect on emissions, put deep and continuing cuts in methane, but at current prices are a little bit more than the others, so they actually come at a cost, and that was the cost that we modelled. That could be wrong. And then finally, those interventions in the win-win zone, which means they reduced emissions and they increased profit, were things like planting trees. And we didn't account for the co-benefits of trees on farm, like increased productivity, reduced mortality, and anti-methanogenic pastures. And so an anti-methanogenic pasture, things like bicerella, lucerne, subterranean clover, because they've got condensed tannins in them. And they're good because the animal's going out and eating them, and they have to eat, provided you can get them to grow, and it's reducing emissions. How am I going for time, Ali?
You are going fine for time. You've used 30 minutes.
Okay, I've only got a couple slides left, and then another quiz. So part one of the interventions that we looked at was Regen Ag. So Regen Ag comprises, I'm probably talking to the converted here, but a whole bunch of different underpinning principles. Cell grazing is a big one, so that means high intensity grazing for a short time, and then you increase the spalling period. So if you think about when Tasmania was first settled, it was mostly set stocking. So what does that mean? You put the animals in there for a year, and you leave them, unless you're drenching or shearing, back in the paddock. And so any regrowth, they're nibbling it off and not allowing it to recover. Cell grazing, high intensity, but like animals, the wildebeest on the African plains, flatten the grass, very high density. It's all flattened against the surface, so that increases decomposition and soil carbon degradation, holds in the soil moisture, but they don't come back for quite a long period, 3 or 6 or 12 months. So that's what cell grazing is. There's a whole bunch of different other principles to Regen Ag, which we didn't look at. So lack of synthetic inputs, no cultivation, zero till. We did look at pasture species diversity, so monoculture versus increasing the diversity of plants. Of all of those components that we looked at, cell grazing had the biggest effect. So if you look at over 100 years of droughts, of medium weather, of La Nina conditions, soil carbon did go up under cell grazing. And that's just emissions. We're not accounting for labour costs, rotation, all that sort of thing. Pasture type rather than pasture species diversity had a bigger effect for productivity. So we looked at increasing the diversity, but it's the actual selection of pasture species had a bigger effect on soil carbon than did diversity. What type are you using there? I'd have to take that question on notice because we did a whole bunch of different species for each environment, but they were environmentally appropriate to the region. But I'll come back to that question. And the ability to sequester carbon, and a lot of interest in soil carbon, really depends on where you start from. Now, most people come along and they say, oh, I got this practice and it increased emissions. And the person over the fence does it and it doesn't get any effect, doesn't have any effect on soil carbon at all. That's because if you're starting from a low base, a degraded paddock, like 0.5% or 1% soil carbon, then your ability to change something and increase soil carbon is pretty high. Whereas if you're starting from high soil carbon, which some are, like 6 or 7 or 8% for a clay, or 5% for a sand, and your ability to change something and increase soil carbon further is pretty low. In fact, your ability to lose soil carbon is much higher. If you get a drought, you get more respiration and you get less productivity.
Can I ask a question, Matthew? Just a quick question.
Soils for Life CEO.
Is this, you've talked a bit about modelling and a bit about actual measured results. Are you talking here about measured outcomes on actual farms or modelling or a combination?
Both. The models are calibrated based on real data.
Just repeat the crux of the question.
So the question was, is that final point there based on measured data or is it based on modelled? My answer is both. The models are calibrated using real data, real measurements to demonstrate they're accurate. And then we simulate that over 100 years. So you get good conditions, you get bad, you get less grazing sort of thing, you get more productivity, and you can look at a long-term result. So short answer is both.
Mark, a quick question to follow up on that. When you're talking about percentages, what depth are you talking about? Are you talking 10 centimetres, 30 centimetres?
Top 30. Your ability to improve soil carbon is highest at the surface and then goes down exponentially with depth. So most soil carbon schemes operate on the top 30 centimetres you can do to the top metre, but your ability to change stuff below 30 centimetres to a metre is a lot less than it is the top stuff. And that's because most roots are in the surface. So were there any win-win-win-win interventions. So improve productivity. We've got to remember agriculture was invented for food production, dairy, milk, meat, wool. Increase profit. Farms and businesses, we're all subject to the cost price squeeze. Costs are going up a lot faster than income. Increase biodiversity. Land is finite. We've only got limited amount of area to increase biodiversity habitat. So were there any interventions that did that? There were two. One farmer had, and this comes back to addressing the underlying deficit, and it's pretty much farm specific. One farmer had too many rabbits, and they were concentrated in the bushland, and he said, well, what happens if I fence that off with a rabbit-proof and game-proof fence to keep the rabbits and wallabies and everything off my improved pasture? And we looked at that and had a big effect on productivity because they were hammering the pastures. That improved soil carbon. That improved carrying capacity, so you could put more animals on it, and it improved profit. But that's bespoke to his farm. If you haven't got too many rabbits, well, it's not going to have any effect. Another one, in Northern Territory, mortality rates are too high. So this person, she had her stocking rates a little bit too high, and it's all right in a good year, but when you get a bad year, and the Northern Territory only really has dry season and wet season, if you get an extended dry season and the carrying capacity is too much, mortality rates are too high. So that intervention for her farm in the NT was really just lowering stocking rates. So she had more feed per animal, you had fatter animals, you had fewer per hectare, but her mortality went down and her overall productivity went up. So this is what I come back to of what is the underlying deficit for the region. And the final thing that I wanted to say before the quiz is what I call the sequestration versus mitigation conundrum. So if I've got time on the x-axis in years and I've got abatement on the y, carbon sequestered, that red line, in trees or in soils will go up and then it'll tail off after time. As the trees get to maturity, carbon sequestration over time goes down. Whereas methane emissions, that blue line, just keep going up. As long as you haven't changed anything else, and nitrous oxide emissions just keep going up. So they keep going up linearly. So if you're relying on carbon sequestration, the red line, to offset your methane emissions or nitrous oxide or CO2, it's harder and harder and harder as the trees approach maturity. That's not to say anything about biodiversity, but carbon sequestration diminishes as your soils fill up or as your trees approach maturity. So if you were to feed a feed supplement or do anything to reduce enteric methane emissions, well, that's permanent. That methane is permanently being voided and it accumulates every year. So you're getting an aggregated benefit. Whereas carbon sequestered in trees and soils can be sequestered, but can be lost. So if you have a bushfire, you've lost that carbon. If you have a drought, or if you cultivate virgin soils for the first time, you lose that carbon. So one way around that is to think about asynchronous planting. So what I've shown there in the green curve is 20 hectares in year one. Then you get a peak of carbon sequestration, and then it diminishes. Whereas that grey line, that sort of funny looking peaked one, is if I planted 1 hectare per year each year for 20 years, my carbon sequestration keeps on going up because you've got trees at different maturation rates until all of those trees hit maturity, and then it starts to diminish. A carbon market is usually 25 years, so that carbon sequestered, subtracting from your farm's emission budget, is going up for about 25 years. Even better, and some farmers are doing this, is they're planting trees and then harvesting them and then making that timber into furniture. Provided that timber is not burnt, that carbon's permanently sequestered out of the atmosphere. And then they plant trees again. So you're always back in that early phase of the carbon sequestration graph, and you're always sequestering more carbon over time. Now, I'm just talking about carbon there. I'm not saying anything about biodiversity, because obviously if you harvest your trees, well, you've impacted your biodiversity habitat as well. So the final quiz, and again, the first person to yell out the right answer gets a prize. Win-win practices are those that what? Yes. The answer was improve productivity, improve profit, improve biodiversity, and reduce emissions. Sorry. What practices in that big graph that I showed reduced emissions the most? Cell grazing? There was another one as well. What was that? native tree plantings and cell grazing. Who said cell grazing? We've got 16 people. This is the final question. What practices reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve profit the most? Related to the fattening lambs? Feed supplements has reduced emissions but reduced profit a bit. Fix an existing problem is right, but I was thinking about that win-win zone. That's correct, but also anti-methanogenic pastures. Who said that? Was you, was it? Sorry. And I think that is about it. So happy to take questions, and that's all. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Matthew. So we'll go straight to questions. I will just say, because the session's being recorded and we want to make sure that we have the right context for the video, I'll get Matthew to just repeat the question that you ask. Also, we've got about 15 minutes. A reminder that, keep your questions relatively concise so that we get as many questions in as possible.
Thanks, Ali. Yep.
You mentioned the anti-methanic pastures. You mentioned Ceradella, Lucerne, Clover. What about chicory and plantain? Are they something you've done research on? And can you comment on that?
Okay, so the question was anti-methanogenic pastures, pastures that reduce methane when the animal eats them. Bicerella does, lotus does, subterranean clover does, lucerne to a lesser extent does. Lucerne has benefits as well for the deep roots. The question was chicory and plantain. Yes, they do. But we have noticed that the animals sometimes they tend to prefer them less than other species sometimes. So we've done research with plantain, with dairy cattle in the far northwest. Yep.
Matt, thanks for your presentation. Have you just released a paper last week about the soil carbon method? And,
Yep.
Can you speak to that? A couple of points on that.
So we did a lot of work on the soil carbon method, and basically we think that the government's probably a little bit too adventurous with their crediting. So that the baseline period is typically a 3-year period where you measure soil carbon, then you implement a practice change, and then the idea is to improve soil carbon. But if people implement that baseline when soil carbon is low, for example at the end of a drought, then the change of practice, soil carbon goes up, not just because your practice change, because you get more rain. So the crux of what we found was if you can increase the duration of the baseline, like for 5 years instead of 3, you get a more representative and stable measure of carbon. And yeah, I guess this is a little bit technical, but people get credited for soil organic carbon, which is the organic carbon from roots and carbohydrates and stuff. You can often, sometimes for some reason, there is a confusion between inorganic carbon, which is things like carbonates from limestone, and organic carbon. And for some reason, which I don't know the result, don't know why, is sometimes that's credited for inorganic carbon and not organic carbon, or it's contaminated sort of thing. So your ostensible gains in carbon over time are a lot more than what they realistically would be. So basically some more work in the measurement protocols and an increased duration of the baseline would be helpful.
And just to add to that, you also mentioned earlier when I asked about depth that the majority of the sequestration of soil carbon in the top 10 or 30% of the profile. In a lot of those projects that we've talked about in that paper, over probably the biggest soil carbon data set in the whole world across those 5 projects that were critiqued, more than 40% of that soil carbon is sequestered below 30 centimetres or below 50 centimetres, and that's not coming out in a hurry. So probably a challenging question is when will the science community start to accept that in fact we can build soil carbon and make a huge contribution to reducing our emissions through soil carbon as opposed to just trees?
Yeah, so the question was, and it was a good question, and I might not remember all of it, but He was talking about a paper that we produced last week, which didn't really critique. It just looked at the carbon sequestered in a bunch of registered carbon projects in Australia now. And the comment was that a lot of your carbon is sequestered beneath 30 or 40 centimetres, I think. And when will the scientific community accept that this carbon is actually being sequestered? I guess I would say I'm a strong believer in evidence-based science. So I look closely at the measurement protocol and the data. And depending on what the results show, I basically form an opinion based on what the data show. And soil carbon, because of the great variability, as I say, it varies from strata to strata and paddock to paddock sort of thing. So you really need to look at the contextualised factors influencing carbon sort of thing and look closely at all of the evidence that you have, management practice change, how the approach was measured sort of thing. But we can catch up and have a chat if you want.
Nat, thanks so much for your presentation. I was curious about I think it was the bottom left-hand quadrant, the win-lose, where your profits went down, but your GHG went down as well. And I'm wondering if you'd overlaying any sort of forecasts around hydrology, biodiversity assets as those markets develop. I imagine that's really going to affect that quadrant. I just wondered if you've done any research there or have any research.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Sam. So the question was the win-lose zone. So practices that we changed that reduced emissions but come at a cost. So that was things like feed supplements, and I can't remember what else I had, to some extent planting vegetation. The question was, have you accounted for income associated with biodiversity? Short answer is yes, we did. That was the variability in those vertical error bars, although that could have been a lot more rigorous. So if there's any economists here, they would poo-poo our approach. But basically, we took a representative distribution, so a low biodiversity certification price, a most likely, and a high. And we drew random samples from that distribution, and we did the same with carbon. So the summary of the story is we accounted for carbon and biodiversity price variation.
On that research that you actually done a study on that were allocated credits, how much of those credits were actually contributed by that random sampling on those projects?
The question was, and I don't understand it fully, on the credits that you received, how much were done by random sampling on those projects? Is that right? How much? So is that a question to do with the variability in the carbon from the sampling? So you got people who are more experts in sampling soil carbon in the room than me, but if you were to register for the ACCU scheme, which is Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme for soil carbon, you need a minimum of 3 strata, and a strata can be by a predominant soil type or a predominant pasture. You need a minimum of 3 cores or 3 samples within that strata. I would advocate more. The more variable your soil is, the more variable your soil carbon is, and you get an uncertainty deduction as well. So if you've got a highly variable soil carbon, you get more deductions from your credits. If you had a hypothetical soil that was identical, no variation in gravel, clay content, anything, which you never do, you'd only need 1 sample, because it would be the practice change here would be the same as what happens over the other side, but you never get that soil in practice. So the more samples you have, the less uncertainty, but the more samples you do, more soil carbon samples, the greater the cost. Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question was, the variability in sampling is huge, and then for a soil carbon method, you sample at max once every 5 years, once at the start, 5 years later. And if you're changing the positions of your samples where you've taken those cores, you might happen to chance upon a higher site with higher soil carbon. That's quite true. Or lower. So I work a little bit with Vera and developing rangelands methodology. So rangelands is obviously 500,000 hectares. You can't possibly sample that rigorously. It'd cost millions of dollars. So what they do is they geo-reference their cores and come back 5 years later and take that sample at the same site. So therefore you're removing all the variability with soil type, with pasture type, with parent material. The only change that could have happened is with pasture and soil carbon at the same spot. So they take, instead of taking a mean across a strata, they take the mean difference of each individual point.
Yeah, there's one here and then back there.
Just a simple sort of practical management plan or strategy. A lot of farmers just burn fallen trees and timber. Have you looked at any other sort of solution to that, or chipping it, or what would you recommend for fallen timber and trees?
The question was, what would you recommend for fallen timber? If that fallen timber is amongst existing timber, like a clump of trees, I would advocate leave it there because it's going to have biodiversity benefits. If it happens to be by itself and it's across a laneway and you have to get rid of it, some farmers we work with, and they're a little bit more entrepreneurial, he's got red gum trees and he makes it into furniture. He makes tables and stuff, and then that carbon, he sells it, and then that carbon is also out of the atmosphere. But if you've got to move it, if you've got to get rid of it, you've got to get rid of it, sort of thing. But if it's along a tree line or you can leave it there, it's probably the best. But at the end of the day, that carbon will eventually go back to the atmosphere when that wood decomposes. And the more you can keep it out of the rain, the slower it decomposes.
Back at the back there.
Yeah, I was just interested in, you mentioned about reducing days on farm for animals, number of days on farm by decreasing the number of days to kill weight. Does that account for upstream emissions in terms of supplementary feeding?
So the question was, I'm interested in the effect of reducing mortality on emissions. Does that account for upstream emissions? Short answer is yes, it does. But yeah, basically the effect is if you increase lamb growth rate and you sell them earlier and you get them off the farm, you're avoiding that proportion of methane where they would have been still on the farm. Now, that is correct. That does have an effect on methane, but it's not as big as an effect as if you manipulate the breeders. So the breeders are the adult ewes or the adult cows because they're always on farm. They're the ones that emit the most methane. So all upstream emissions are accounted for. So if you've purchased grain, and it's a little bit punitive, I think, so that all of the emissions associated with that barley grain that you've imported have to be counted as part of your emissions budget. That's how it is, and it's moving towards Scope 3, which is counting for emissions post-farm gate as well.
All right, we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one at the back here and one here, and then if we can get to you, we've got a third. So let's start at the back.
Just on your re-veg slide of mass planting at the beginning, or multiple plantings and furniture making. I've heard a conversation in the carbon accounting language that historical plantings, there's a sort of a pre and post re-veg line where 30 years of historical planting on a farm isn't counted as gains into the future.
Is that in terms of is that in terms of carbon or biodiversity?
In carbon.
So the question was, he's heard a conversation about there's a distinction between trees that are around 30 years old and after 30 years old they don't have much effect. Did I understand you right?
Somebody wishing to account for the carbon benefit or negative on their farm from today onwards.
Yep.
I've heard a conversation, I've been involved in a conversation where historical re-veg planting, conservation plantings, aren't counted.
Correct.
As the baseline.
Yep.
So effectively a landowner has got to start fresh and start planting today.
That's right.
Improve tomorrow.
So
And the historical work is really, of course, it has a farm value and an ecological value, but it doesn't count for account.
And if I had $1 for every time that statement was made, I'd be a rich man, because that comes back to additionality. So the question was, if I've planted trees in the past, and then I think about enrolling in a carbon market, can I get paid for those trees I planted 5 or 10 years ago? Short answer is no. And that's because the government want additionality. So they want to say, okay, you've planted more trees today, and then you get paid because you weren't going to do it before you enrolled in a carbon market, but you are going to get paid now. So that's called additionality. So the government are wanting someone to change something so that that carbon in trees or soils is additional to what would have been sucked out of the atmosphere had I not paid you. So that's called additionality, and I can see where farmers are coming from. If you've planted trees 10 or 30 years ago, which is going to have more benefit, well then you can't get paid for it, but you're going to have biodiversity benefits sort of thing. So benefits on both sides. Sam?
Well, no. We've got one question here, and then I'm under very strict instructions to stop us at 9:55. So 30 seconds.
Mine's a very quick one, and it addresses this gentleman's question about what do you do with wood that trees that fall over. So my question is, did you look at the use of biochar, so turning green waste through pyrolysis into char that can then be used to enrich the soil? Have you looked at the effect of biochar?
So the question was, have you looked at the effects of biochar, for example, turning fallen wood into biochar? Short answer is yes. Done a lot of research on biochar. Feeding it to livestock can improve live weight gain. Spreading it on the soil improves soil carbon. In fact, the dung beetles, if you feed it to livestock, it enriches their manure. The dung beetles get it carried into the soil, so the dung beetles are integrating that carbon 30 centimetres down. You can see the black tunnels. Biochar is very good, but you have to think about the trade-off between digestibility, which is lower pyrolysis temperature, and if you heat it up higher, you lose more carbon, but it's more stable as well. So biochar, sort of like charcoal. Sam?
No,
Done.
we're not
Okay.
allowed. We are not allowed. I'm under very
Thanks.
strict instructions.
Thanks very much.